In 1964, in the jungles of Southeast Asia, one man had not slept for 3 days. He did not move. He did not speak. He barely breathed. Beneath his face was wet earth, soaked with rot and rain. A few meters away, along a narrow jungle track, armed men were moving slowly. He could hear fabric brushing against leaves. He could hear metal lightly tapping a buckle. He could hear breathing. If he coughed, he would be killed. If he moved, he would be killed. He did not know how many there were. He knew only one thing: if they went further, someone would die tomorrow. This man officially did not exist. His name was not in any documents. His unit was not supposed to be here. This is how the real story of the Australian Special Forces began. In the early 1960s, Australia lived in a strange calm. A country that seemed geographically isolated from the world had grown used to thinking of itself as safe. Oceans were perceived as natural walls. Politicians spoke of stability, growth, and the future. War felt like something European, Asian, but not Australian. That calm was an illusion. After World War II, the world stopped being clear-cut. Wars no longer began with formal declarations. They began quietly, through borders that existed only on maps, through men without insignia, through operations that could never be acknowledged publicly. Southeast Asia became the epicenter of this new reality. Indonesia, newly independent, sought influence and strength. Malaysia lived under constant internal and external pressure. Communist movements grew, fueled by ideology and weapons. China and the Soviet Union looked at the region as a field of power. And Australia, whether it liked it or not, was very close. The Australian army of that era was honest, but outdated. It was built for wars with rules, front lines, formations, orders, flowing from the top down. It was not prepared for conflicts where the enemy dissolved into the jungle, and victory was measured not by captured ground, but by the absence of shots. The problem was not the soldiers. The problem was the mindset. The British understood this earlier. Their experience in Malaya, Africa, and Europe showed that sometimes wars are not won by armies, but by small groups capable of operating without recognition or applause. The SAS was not prestige. It was a tool for tasks that could not be discussed openly. Australia hesitated. Creating such a unit meant admitting that the old system was no longer enough. But reality kept pressing harder. In 1957, far from public attention, a new unit appeared in Western Australia, the Special Air Service Regiment. Officially, an experiment. Unofficially, an attempt to create a new kind of soldier. From the very beginning, SASR was not advertised. There were no posters, no slogans. Even within the military, many viewed it with suspicion. Some thought it was a gamble. Others saw it as a British imitation. Selection began without grand speeches. Candidates were not humiliated. They were simply worn down. Marches lasted for hours, not for speed, for endurance. Men were sent into the bush with a map and a compass, sometimes at night, sometimes after a full day without sleep. Instructions were minimal. Mistakes were not discussed. Instructors did not interfere. They observed reactions. Those who made excuses were gone. Those who grew angry were gone. Those who accepted the conditions and kept moving stayed. It became clear very quickly. SAS was not about heroics. It was about patience. By the early 1960s, a distinct culture had formed inside the unit. People spoke little. They did not argue. They did not ask unnecessary questions. Everyone understood that sooner or later you would be left alone, and you had to cope. These were exactly the people needed when, in 1963, the situation on the Indonesian-Malaysian border began to spiral out of control. Officially, there was no war. In reality, it had already begun. Indonesian units crossed the border in small groups. They tested reactions, looked for weak points, applied psychological pressure. Sometimes they fired. Sometimes they vanished. Responding with large forces would mean open war. Something else was required. SAS was given a task that was never publicized: long-range patrols, covert observation, intelligence gathering. Minimal contact, maximum silence. The first patrols entered the jungles of Borneo with no guarantee of returning on schedule. Maps were inaccurate. Terrain was brutal. Communications were unreliable, sometimes non-existent. 4 men. Weeks of autonomy. No support. The jungle did not forgive mistakes. Humidity destroyed weapons. Ammunition had to be sealed better than food. Leeches were everywhere. Infections began from the smallest cuts. Sleep was short and uneasy. The hardest part was waiting. Hours of immobility. Days without contact. The constant feeling of being watched. SAS learned to become part of the terrain. They moved slowly, sometimes only a few hundred meters per hour. They stopped, listened, waited. They could lie in the mud for hours while armed men passed just meters away. And they learned not to shoot. That was the hardest lesson. By mid-1964, patrols began to produce results. Indonesian units grew more cautious. They sensed a presence but could not define it. Sometimes they fired into emptiness. Sometimes they withdrew without explanation. In one patrol, Australians observed enemy movement for several days. Routes, numbers, timing, everything was known. They could have wiped the group out completely. But that would have been a mistake. Instead, they did what they did best. They revealed their presence and disappeared. A brief contact, a few shots, and silence again. It was enough. From that moment on, doubt crept in on the other side. And in this kind of war, doubt was more powerful than a bullet. By late 1964, the jungle had learned their names, even if no one spoke them aloud. The Indonesian patrols no longer moved casually. They stopped more often. They spread out. They avoided old routes. Sometimes they turned back for no visible reason. The Australians had not increased their numbers nor their firepower. They had increased something else: pressure. Every SAS patrol now operated under a single unspoken rule: never be predictable. Routes changed constantly. Camps were never reused. Even the time of movement shifted from patrol to patrol. Sometimes they moved at dawn, sometimes in deep night, sometimes not at all for days. The enemy could never be sure whether silence meant absence or proximity. Inside the patrols, discipline became absolute. Noise was treated as danger. A snapped twig could freeze 4 men in place for minutes. Equipment was taped, padded, modified. Metal never touched metal. Zippers were avoided. Even breathing was controlled. Food was cold. Fires were forbidden. Men lost weight fast. Not from hunger, from tension. The jungle was not just dense. It was layered. Canopy, undergrowth, roots, swamp. Visibility could drop to 5 meters. Sound behaved strangely, echoing where it shouldn't, disappearing where it should carry. Every sense had to work harder. During one patrol, an SAS team tracked an enemy group for nearly a week without being detected. They followed discarded food wrappers, boot impressions, broken vegetation. They learned the enemy's habits, when they stopped, when they relaxed. At one point, the distance closed to less than 10 meters. No shots were fired. Instead, the patrol withdrew silently, circled wide, and reappeared days later on the same route, this time leaving unmistakable signs of observation. Footprints that appeared and vanished. A disturbed camp with nothing taken. The psychological effect was immediate. Reports from intercepted communications showed confusion. Accusations. Commanders questioned their own men. Morale dropped without a single confirmed casualty. This was exactly what SAS doctrine aimed for. But the jungle does not allow perfect control. In early 1965, an Australian patrol made a mistake, small, almost invisible. A movement slightly too fast. A silhouette caught at the wrong angle. Shots erupted at close range. There was no dramatic firefight, no heroic charge, just chaos compressed into seconds. One SAS soldier was hit in the leg. Another was grazed. The patrol broke contact instantly, using smoke and terrain, retreating exactly as trained. The enemy fired wildly into the vegetation, never seeing who they were fighting. Extraction took 2 days. The wounded man survived, but the incident changed something. It reminded everyone, including command, that invisibility was not invincibility. From that point on, patrol lengths increased. Missions became longer. The emphasis shifted from observation alone to area denial. If the enemy could not move freely, he could not operate effectively. The Indonesians responded. They began deploying larger groups. They laid crude traps. They set ambushes along likely routes. They listened more carefully. Sometimes they stayed still for days, waiting. The jungle became tense. In mid-1965, an SAS patrol operating near a river crossing detected something unusual. Silence that felt artificial. Birds were absent. Insects were still. They stopped immediately. For nearly an hour, they did nothing. Then they withdrew, slowly, deliberately. Minutes later, gunfire erupted where they would have been. The ambush collapsed on emptiness. From that moment, the patrol leader understood something critical. The enemy was learning. This was no longer a one-sided game. As the conflict escalated, SAS patrols were sometimes authorized limited offensive actions. Quick strikes, minimal exposure. No prolonged engagements. One such operation involved the interception of an Indonesian reconnaissance team preparing to cross the border. The Australians observed them for hours. When the moment came, the engagement lasted less than a minute. It was over before the jungle fully reacted. No celebration followed. The patrol withdrew immediately, moving through water to erase tracks, splitting and rejoining miles away. Extraction came days later. Back at base, there were no medals, no announcements, only quiet acknowledgement. By 1966, SASR had become something very different from what it was on paper. It was no longer an experiment. It was a proven instrument of policy, one that allowed governments to act without speaking. The men themselves changed too. They spoke less than ever. Humor became darker. Trust within patrols became absolute. There was no rank in the jungle, only responsibility. One patrol commander later said that the hardest part was not fear or exhaustion or even combat. It was restraint. Knowing you could act and choosing not to. By late 1966, Indonesian operations across the border slowed significantly. Routes went unused, patrols turned back early. Reports spoke of unknown forces and invisible enemies. Officially, nothing had happened. Unofficially, the balance had shifted. But wars like this never end cleanly. They fade. They leave scars that don't show on maps. And for SAS, something else was approaching. Vietnam. When Australia officially committed forces to Vietnam, the public saw uniforms, bases, and press releases. SAS saw something else. They saw terrain that erased certainty. They saw an enemy that did not need to win, only to endure. And they saw a war where visibility was dangerous. For SASR, Vietnam was not an escalation. It was a refinement. The jungle in Vietnam was different from Borneo. Thicker in places, more populated, more watched. Villages, trails, river traffic, everything blurred the line between civilian and combatant. Mistakes here had consequences far beyond the patrol. SAS operations focused on long-range reconnaissance. 6 men, sometimes 4, inserted far beyond friendly lines. Their task was not to fight, but to see and survive. They moved mostly at night. Daytime was for hiding. Observation posts were built low, almost underground. Leaves were stitched into uniforms. Faces darkened. Even exposed skin was treated. Patrols could remain in position for days, watching supply routes, counting men, timing movement, identifying patterns. Often the same routes were used repeatedly until they weren't. The Viet Cong adapted quickly. They used decoys, false trails, deliberate noise. Sometimes they moved openly, daring observers to act. Other times they disappeared completely. Contact, when it happened, was sudden and violent. In one operation, an SAS patrol detected enemy movement, closing rapidly from multiple directions. They had been compromised. How was never clear. There was no time for discussion. The patrol leader made a decision that saved them. Break contact immediately, without returning fire. Smoke, movement, separation. They ran through terrain that tore skin and equipment alike. One man fell. Another dragged him without slowing. Behind them, gunfire erupted. Disorganized, angry. The patrol escaped. No one spoke during extraction. Losses were not always visible. Men returned thinner, quieter. Some stopped sleeping properly. Others slept too much. No one complained. SAS culture did not encourage it. By 1968, SASR had established a reputation among Allied forces. Americans respected their effectiveness, though sometimes misunderstood their methods. SAS did not seek engagements. They avoided attention. They preferred to leave nothing behind. Their reports, however, were precise. Routes mapped, units identified, patterns revealed. Entire operations were shaped by information gathered by men who were never meant to be seen. But Vietnam was relentless. One patrol was inserted to observe a suspected base area. For days, nothing happened. Then, without warning, movement increased dramatically. Troops, equipment, defensive positions. The patrol was sitting on something important. Extraction was requested. Denied. They stayed. On the 4th day, enemy forces passed within meters. One man's boot nearly touched an SAS operator's hand. He did not move. His breathing slowed until it barely existed. They remained hidden. That night, artillery struck the area based on their coordinates. The patrol exfiltrated at dawn. Later analysis showed that the strike disrupted a planned offensive. hundreds of lives were likely saved. No one outside a small room ever knew how close it came. By the end of the 1960s, SASR was exhausted but experienced. The unit had learned what modern warfare truly was: fragmented, ambiguous, and unforgiving. They had also learned something darker. There was no finish line, tours ended, deployments rotated, but the mindset remained. Men returned home carrying silence instead of stories. Australia would later speak openly about its special forces. Medals would be awarded. Histories written. But the men of the 1960s were different. They had operated in a time when acknowledgement was impossible, when success meant nothing happened, when survival depended on being forgotten. And that was exactly how they wanted it. By the end of the 1960s, Australia had entered a new era of conflict, and SASR had already changed the way the nation understood warfare. The jungles, the long patrols, the quiet observation, all of it had transformed a small, experimental unit into an indispensable tool. They were no longer a copy of the British SAS. They were uniquely Australian. Their style, their methods, their mindset, all forged in sweat, fear, and silence. The men returned home, but not as heroes. Few knew what they had done. Few ever would. Public reports barely mentioned SAS operations. They were classified, unacknowledged, invisible, and that was by design. The hardest battles were not fought with bullets. They were fought in the mind, waiting, watching, deciding whether to act or remain still, living in constant tension, knowing a single mistake could end life instantly. Some could not bear it. Some left. Others stayed. The survivors carried the weight in quiet. They did not speak of it. They did not seek glory. They simply did what was necessary and then vanished into the ordinary world. Yet their influence was profound. Commanders adapted to SAS methods. New units learned their techniques. Operations around the world began to echo the lessons of Borneo and Vietnam. Small, autonomous teams, patience, intelligence over force, the subtlety of presence. The legacy of SAS in the 1960s was not medals or parades. It was a philosophy. The modern battlefield was not about who could shoot fastest or move hardest. It was about who could see first, understand, and disappear without a trace. Their greatest victories were invisible, lives saved without acknowledgement, operations completed without applause, enemies unsettled without ever knowing why. Australia had gained more than soldiers. It had gained a mindset. And the men themselves, those lying in mud, listening to every sound, weighing every breath, understood a truth few ever learn. Real power does not need to be seen. Real effectiveness does not need to be announced. Silence can be the most potent weapon of all. The 1960s ended, but the shadow of their presence lingered. In jungles, in the quiet reports on desks, in every young soldier trained in their methods, SAS's influence endured. Their story began in the mud and rain, with names unspoken and deeds unknown. It ended the same way. Quiet, invisible, unforgettable. Because true skill does not seek recognition. True courage does not demand applause. And the most enduring legacy is one that leaves no trace except in those who know it existed. The Australian SAS of the 1960s had proven something timeless. If you survive the jungle, the unseen war, and yourself, you carry a knowledge that no medal can match. And that knowledge is enough.